Forget everything you've seen in movies about the Tudor court. Forget the sweeping romances, the noble knights with their poetic declarations, and the queens gliding through pristine castles with swans floating in the moat. That's a historical theme park, a sanitized fantasy for people who like their history without the smell. The real Tudor court was a snake pit lined with velvet, a place where ambition had the metallic tang of fresh blood, and the air was thick with the perfume of paranoia. It wasn't a place of grand passions, it was a place of grinding, desperate survival. Power wasn't won on the battlefield, it was won in the bedroom, in the confessional, and in the dark, piss-soaked corners of Hampton Court Palace. And the deadliest weapon in this war wasn't a sword or a dagger, it was a rumour, a whisper. A carefully crafted story about who was sleeping with whom, a fiction designed to curdle a king's love into homicidal rage. This wasn't about love, and it was barely about lust. This was about political assassination by way of the crotch, a masterclass in how to destroy your enemies by convincing the most powerful man in the kingdom that his dick had been disrespected. Sound romantic? It wasn't. It was a stinking, terrified, high-stakes game where the losers didn't just get fired, they got shorter by a head. We're about to crawl into the grimy, sweaty reality of how a simple accusation of illicit sex could bring down the most powerful people in England. But before we bow to our historical overlords, I need to know who's in my little army of degenerates. Sound off in the comments. What patch of Earth are you on, and what's the time on your sundial? Let me know who's ready to watch the powerful get filthy. All right, let's bend the knee for now. Let's begin at the beginning, not of the affair, but of the plot. You see, an act of treasonous adultery doesn't just happen, it has to be born. It's conceived in the bitter mind of a rival, gestated in whispers, and finally birthed in a torrent of accusation and feigned outrage. Imagine you are Thomas Cromwell, the blacksmith's son, the ultimate political operator. You've clawed your way to the top, right into the king's inner circle. But there's a problem, and her name is Anne Boleyn. She is the queen. She is clever, she is arrogant, and she has a network of allies, a faction of her own. She's also failing at her one non-negotiable job, producing a male heir. This failure is a crack in her armor, a weakness you can exploit. But you can't just tell the king, hey, your wife is a political inconvenience and her religious reforms are annoying me. Henry VIII is still, on some level, infatuated with the woman for whom he broke with the entire Catholic world. No, you need to make him hate her. You need to turn his love into a poison that he administers himself. The preparation for this kind of political hit is not about sharpening blades, it's about sharpening tongues. It begins with observation, a cold, predatory cataloguing of the Queen's daily life. Cromwell and his agents become ghosts in the palace. They watch. Who does she talk to? Who does she laugh with? Who gets the honor of fetching her dropped glove? Every smile, every shared joke, every moment of casual familiarity is noted down, not in a diary, but in the cold ledger of political ammunition. The pre-ritual is about finding the raw materials of slander. You need names, you need men. Men close to the Queen, men who are trusted, men whose proximity can be twisted from innocent friendship into something sordid and conspiratorial. You look at the court musicians, they're commoners, low-born but talented, perfect. An affair with one of them would be humiliating for the king, a stain on his honor. Mark Smeaton, the handsome lute player, put his name on the list. He's ambitious and a little naive. He can be broken. You look at the king's own friends, the gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, men like Henry Norris and William Brereton. These are high-stakes targets. Accusing them is risky, but the payoff is immense. It suggests a conspiracy right under the king's nose, a nest of vipers in his own chamber. It feeds his deepest paranoia. The final, most monstrous touch You need a scapegoat from her own family. Her brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, he's witty, charming, and dangerously close to his sister. Their bond is tight, a source of political strength. So you decide to twist that bond into something incestuous, something so unnatural it will horrify the court and disgust the king to his very core. This isn't just an accusation of adultery anymore. You're building a narrative of monstrous depravity. The preparation involves a slow, insidious process of psychological warfare. You start planting seeds, a carefully placed word to a gossip-mongering ambassador, a question posed to a nervous lady-in-waiting. Did you not think the Queen looked upon Master Norris with uncommon favour today? You don't state anything as fact, you just ask. You create a fog of suspicion. The anxiety builds not just for the targets, but for the plotters. What if the king doesn't buy it? What if the Queen gets wind of the plot and turns the tables? The entire enterprise is a tightrope walk over a pit of fire. The preparation is also about identifying the weak links. Who among the Queen's circle can be pressured? Who has debts? Who has secrets of their own? A man in debt can be bought. A man with a secret can be blackmailed. You find a lady-in-waiting, maybe the Countess of Worcester, who has her own indiscretions to hide. You lean on her, you promise her safety in exchange for a little testimony, just a few details, a memory of a closed door, a late-night conversation. It doesn't have to be true, it just has to be plausible enough to start the avalanche. This entire pre-ritual is a masterpiece of filth, a construction project of pure malice. You're not just planning to kill a queen, you're meticulously crafting the justification for it, brick by sordid brick. You're building a cage of lies, and the final step will be to convince the king himself that he's the one who found the key. The sheer, calculated coldness of it is the most terrifying part. It's the quiet, methodical work of men in fine clothes, sitting in panelled rooms, calmly discussing how to use sex, shame, and torture to rearrange the political landscape of an entire nation. They are preparing for a bloodbath, but they do it with the detached air of accountants balancing a book. The sweat on their brows is not from passion, but from the cold, hard work of orchestrating a royal downfall. Now let's talk about the stage for this drama. The environment of the Tudor court was a character in itself, and it was the perfect accomplice to conspiracy. Forget the sun-drenched, airy palaces you imagine. Think of Hampton Court or Greenwich Palace as vast, sprawling labyrinths of paranoia. They were a bizarre mix of public spectacle and private squalor. You had the grand state rooms, designed to awe foreign visitors with their sheer scale and opulence, enormous tapestries depicting heroic battles, ceilings gilded with gold leaf, vast windows letting in the pale English light. But for every one of these public spaces there were 100 private hidden ones. The power of the court didn't reside in the throne room, it resided in the corridors. These were the arteries of the palace, long, narrow, and often dark, panelled in dark wood that seemed to absorb all light and sound. The air here was different. It didn't smell of incense and beeswax like the chapel. It smelled of secrets. It was a cocktail of wood smoke from the thousands of fireplaces, the faint but persistent odour of human sweat clinging to heavy wool and velvet, and the underlying hint of rot from the rushes on the floor, which were rarely changed and often soaked with spilled wine, discarded food, and even urine from courtiers and their dogs. This was the perfect breeding ground for whispers. A conversation could be had in a shadowy window seat, the heavy tapestry muffling the words, turning them into a conspiratorial hiss. A deal could be struck in a darkened alcove, the only light coming from a flickering torch down the hall, casting long, monstrous shadows that made every face look like a mask. The architecture itself was designed for intrigue. The palaces were a maze of interconnected apartments, each with its own warren of back rooms, servants' passages and garderobes, the Tudor equivalent of a toilet, which was often just a chute emptying into the moat below. These weren't just functional spaces, they were tactical ones. A servant could slip unseen through a hidden door behind a tapestry to eavesdrop on their master. A lover, or an alleged lover, could be smuggled up a back staircase. The very walls had ears, not just figuratively, but almost literally, as the thin wattle and door partitions did little to stop sound from travelling. The tools of this trade were not daggers and poisons in the traditional sense. The primary tool was the human tongue, sharpened to a razor's edge, but it was supported by physical objects that took on a sinister weight. A piece of paper, for instance. Paper was expensive, a luxury. A letter written with a goose quill pen dipped in oak gall ink was a formal, significant object. Forging such a letter, a love note from a courtier to the queen perhaps, was a high-risk, high-reward act of craftsmanship. The forger would have to mimic the handwriting, the style of prose, even the type of paper the supposed author used. That forged letter, if discovered in the right place, was a piece of dynamite. Then there was the bed. The royal bed was a fortress of status, a massive four-poster oak structure hung with velvet curtains embroidered with gold thread. It was a public symbol of the dynasty's legitimacy. To poison this symbol, you didn't need to poison the sheets. You needed to poison its reputation. The tools were the testimonies of chambermaids, coerced or bribed, who would speak of what they saw or heard through those thick velvet curtains. The lumpy straw mattresses of the lesser courtiers and servants were also tools. A guard could be paid to notice a gentleman of the court sneaking out of a lady-in-waiting's chamber at an ungodly hour, the rustle of the straw a supposed soundtrack to their sin. Even clothing was a weapon. A misplaced handkerchief, a ribbon given as a favour. These were the receipts of an illicit affair. Anne Boleyn was known for her fashionable French hoods and elegant gowns. A spy could report on who she smiled at while adjusting her sleeve, turning a meaningless gesture into a secret signal. The environment reinforced the power dynamics at every turn. The king's rooms were central, spacious, and filled with light. The further you were from the king, literally and figuratively, the smaller, darker, and colder your assigned quarters became. To be moved to a damp, draughty room in a forgotten wing of the palace was a clear sign your star was falling. The entire physical plant of the court was a map of power, and the plotters knew how to read it. They understood that the perfect place to ruin a queen wasn't in the open, but in the close, fetid, claustrophobic spaces where privacy was an illusion and every wall was a potential witness. The very air, thick with secrets and suspicion, did half their work for them. At the heart of this web of filth and fear sits the authority figure, the ultimate arbiter of fate, King Henry VIII. But to understand the power dynamic, you have to understand that Henry isn't just a man. He's an institution, a demigod wrapped in layers of insecurity. His power is absolute, yet he is perhaps the most paranoid man in the kingdom. And it's this combination of absolute authority and deep-seated psychological fragility that makes him both the ultimate weapon and the ultimate victim of the court's machinations. The primary power player, the one pulling the strings, isn't always the king himself. It's the man who has his ear. In our scenario, it's Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell is the embodiment of the new man, a commoner who has risen on pure talent and ruthlessness. He understands power not as a birthright, but as a complex machine that requires constant maintenance, lubrication, and the occasional removal of a jammed part, usually with an axe. The dynamic between Henry and Cromwell is a grotesque symbiosis. Henry has the power of life and death, but he lacks the patience and the stomach for the dirty work. He wants results, not processes. He wants a new wife and a male heir He doesn't want to be bogged down in the sordid details of how to get rid of the old one. Cromwell, on the other hand, is a master of detail. He lives in the grime. He orchestrates the spies, bribes the witnesses, directs the interrogations. He is the king's architect of reality, presenting Henry with a finished, carefully constructed narrative of treason that demands only one simple response: a signature on a death warrant. The hypocrisy is breathtaking. Cromwell, who is engineering this entire farce, presents himself as the loyal, heartbroken servant, forced to bring this terrible news to his beloved master. Imagine the scene. Cromwell, his face a mask of solemn grief, kneels before the king. He speaks in hushed, reluctant tones about the monstrous rumors he has been forced to investigate. He professes his undying loyalty to the crown and his personal anguish at the Queen's alleged betrayal. It's a performance of staggering cynicism. He is the arsonist calling the fire department, pointing at the blaze he himself started. And Henry, for his part, plays his role perfectly. He explodes in rage and self-pity. "The great whore!" he bellows, his ego wounded to the core. His fury is real, but it's a directed fury. Cromwell has built a channel for the king's discontent, and Henry's rage flows right where Cromwell wants it to. The king's authority is wielded like a cudgel, but the hand guiding it is Cromwell's. The power dynamic extends downwards in a cascade of terror. The king's council, men of noble birth, who might despise a commoner like Cromwell, are forced to fall in line. To question the evidence against the Queen is to risk being implicated yourself. To show her sympathy is to mark yourself as a traitor. So they sign off on the investigation. They sit as judges in a trial where the verdict is preordained, their faces grim masks of judicial gravity. They are all complicit, trapped in the web Cromwell has woven. Below them are the pawns. The court musician, Mark Smeaton, is a perfect example. He has no real power. He is a plaything of the elite. When he is arrested and taken to Cromwell's house, the power dynamic becomes brutally physical. It's no longer about whispered words, it's about the rack. Cromwell, the detached minister of state, likely presides over the torture. He needs a confession, a cornerstone for his case. Smeaton, a young man who likely did nothing more than flirt harmlessly, finds himself in a world of unimaginable pain. The power of the state is concentrated into the sickening crunch of his bones and the searing pain in his joints. His confession, screamed out in agony, is not a reflection of truth. It is a testament to the absolute power of the authority figure to manufacture it. The ultimate irony is that Henry, the font of all this power, is also its prisoner. His paranoia, expertly stoked by Cromwell, isolates him. He can't trust his wife, he can't trust his friends, he can't even trust his own judgment. He is left with only the version of reality that his chief minister has so carefully constructed for him. In his gilded cage, surrounded by fawning sycophants, the king is the loneliest and most easily manipulated man in England. He holds the power of life and death, but the narrative, the story that tells him how to use that power, is written by someone else. And that is the true, terrifying power dynamic of the Tudor court. The one who controls the story controls the king. Before the accusations fly and the torture begins, we need to crawl inside the heads of the people living through this. What did they actually believe? Their internal world was a chaotic swamp of fervent religious faith, terrifying superstition, and desperate psychological justification. This wasn't a secular world of cool, rational actors. This was a world where God's displeasure could be read in a failed harvest, and the devil was a literal physical presence lurking in the shadows of the court. Their faith was the frame for everything. For King Henry, his entire break with Rome was justified as a holy mission. He saw himself as chosen by God to lead England to a purer form of Christianity. Therefore, his desire for a new wife wasn't just lust or political expediency, it was a divine necessity. He needed a son to secure his dynasty and protect his religious reforms. In his mind, Anne Boleyn's failure to produce an heir wasn't just a biological problem, it was a sign of God's judgment. It meant she was not the righteous queen he had believed her to be. This belief made him terrifyingly susceptible to the idea that she was not just unfaithful, but inherently sinful, perhaps even a witch who had ensnared him with spells. The charge of witchcraft was, in fact, whispered against Anne. It was a convenient way to explain away the king's long and obsessive infatuation with her. How could a great king be so besotted with one woman for so long? It couldn't be mere love. It must have been dark magic. This blend of religious fervor and folk superstition was potent. People genuinely believed that curses were real, that a misplaced glance could bewitch you, and that sexual sin could bring divine retribution not just on the sinners, but on the entire kingdom. The plotters, like Cromwell, weaponized this. They weren't just accusing Anne of adultery, they were accusing her of offending God and endangering the soul of the nation. They were painting her as a source of spiritual pollution that had to be cleansed, a narrative that resonated deeply with the anxieties of the age. For the accused, their internal world was a nightmare. Imagine being Anne Boleyn, a devout reformist who saw herself as an instrument of God's will, suddenly facing accusations of incest and witchcraft. The psychological whiplash would be devastating. Her letters from the Tower show a woman oscillating between righteous indignation and sheer terror, clinging to her faith while the world she knew dissolved into a paranoid fantasy. She appeals to Henry, not just as a husband, but as a fellow believer, reminding him of the final judgment they will both face before God. It's a desperate plea to a shared spiritual reality that for the king has already been replaced by a more convenient one. And what about the pawns like Mark Smeaton? A commoner and a musician, his world was likely filled with a more grounded set of beliefs and fears. He would have been raised on folk tales and parish sermons. He would have believed in hellfire for oath-breakers and liars. The psychological horror of his situation was twofold. First, the physical agony of torture. Second, the spiritual agony of being forced to confess to sins he didn't commit, damning himself in the eyes of God and man. His interrogators would have used this, telling him that a confession was the only path to saving his soul, that clinging to a lie would guarantee eternal damnation. The pressure to break would have been both physical and metaphysical. Then there's the justification. How did men like Cromwell, who were often pious in their own way, rationalize orchestrating such a brutal and dishonest purge? They likely told themselves it was a necessary evil, a greater good argument. The stability of the kingdom was paramount. The king's will was God's will. Anne and her faction were a threat to that stability, a cancer on the body politic. Therefore, cutting them out, no matter how brutally, was a form of political surgery. It was for the health of England. And this justification allows for an incredible degree of moral detachment. You're not destroying 5 innocent men and a queen for personal gain. You're a patriot, a servant of the state, a reluctant executioner doing God's dirty work. It's a timeless psychological trick, one that allows ordinary people to participate in extraordinary cruelty. Their internal monologues, if we could hear them, would be a cacophony of prayer, fear, ambition, and self-deception, a rich and terrifying stew of the medieval mind trying to make sense of a world where lust, power, and salvation were tangled together in a bloody, inextricable knot. The first point of contact in this assassination by slander is not a physical blow but a verbal one. It's the moment the carefully constructed rumor breaks containment and strikes its first target. This isn't a grand public denunciation. It's something far more insidious and chaotic, a slip of the tongue, a deliberately clumsy confrontation designed to look like an accident. The plan is in motion, the targets are selected, the justification is ready. Now Cromwell needs a trigger. He needs one of the accused, to panic, and he finds his man in Mark Smeaton, the lute player. The initial contact is likely deceptively casual. Smeaton is perhaps summoned to Cromwell's opulent house at Austin Friars. He probably thinks it's an opportunity, a commission, a chance to gain favour with the king's chief minister. The room would be intimidating, dark wood, tapestries, the smell of money and power. Cromwell would be initially charming, disarming, perhaps praising Smeaton's musical talent. And then the first blow. It's a question, dropped into the conversation like a stone into a calm pond. "Master Smeaton," Cromwell might say, his voice losing its warmth, "it has been noted you have received many gifts from Her Majesty the Queen, unusually generous gifts for a man of your station." The shock for Smeaton is immediate and total. The air in the room changes. The friendly chat has become an interrogation. His mind would race. He has accepted gifts, of course. It's part of the system of courtly patronage. But Cromwell's tone infuses the innocent fact with a sinister meaning. Smeaton would stammer, try to explain, but the trap has been sprung. His denial sounds weak. His surprise looks like guilt. Cromwell presses, his questions becoming more specific, more leading. "Have you not been in the Queen's private chambers late at night? Did you not once swear your devotion to her?" Every question is a new thread in the web. The first point of contact is designed to induce psychological vertigo. It rips the victim out of their reality and plunges them into a nightmare where every past action is recontextualized as evidence of a crime. Simultaneously, another point of contact is made, this one targeting someone closer to the Queen. Cromwell might have a quiet word with a member of the Queen's own household, perhaps her lady-in-waiting, Lady Worcester, who he knows has her own secrets. This isn't a direct accusation, it's a warning. He might mention that the king is in a foul mood and is investigating certain improprieties at court. He would let it be known that those who cooperate will find the king's mercy, while those who conceal the truth will face his wrath. This is a classic prisoner's dilemma. He creates a panic, forcing people to choose between loyalty to the Queen and their own survival. Lady Worcester, terrified that her own affairs might be exposed, breaks down and offers a piece of information. She confesses that she saw the Queen acting flirtatiously with Henry Norris. It might be a complete fabrication, a desperate attempt to deflect attention from herself, but it doesn't matter. Cromwell now has what he needs, an internal witness. The initial shockwave radiates outwards. The news that Smeaton is being questioned by Cromwell would spread through the court like a plague. The atmosphere would shift from suspicion to open fear. Courtiers would suddenly find pressing business elsewhere, avoiding any contact with the Boleyn faction. The targets themselves would feel the chill first. A friendly greeting in a corridor is met with a blank stare. An invitation to a game of bowls is politely declined. They are being isolated, quarantined, before any formal charge has even been laid. The first contact with the king is the most critical. Cromwell, armed with Smeaton's coerced admissions and Lady Worcester's testimony, goes to Henry. This is the moment of detonation. He doesn't present a full-blown conspiracy yet. He presents a troubling first report. He frames it as a loyal servant's duty, sharing a painful discovery. The king's reaction is the linchpin of the entire plot. Henry's ego, already bruised by the lack of a male heir, is a tinderbox of insecurity. The suggestion of infidelity, especially with a low-born musician, is the spark. The initial shock for the king is a profound narcissistic wound. The woman he defied the Pope for has made a fool of him. His rage is immediate, volcanic, and utterly lacking in nuance. The clumsy, chaotic nature of this first contact is its genius. It doesn't look like a polished conspiracy. It looks like a scandal that is messily and reluctantly coming to light. It allows the king to feel like he is uncovering a truth rather than being fed a lie. All illusions of courtly decorum are shattered. The game of whispers is over. The screaming is about to begin. Once the initial shock has ripped a hole in the fabric of the court, the real horror begins. This isn't a swift and clean execution. It's a descent into a grinding psychological meat grinder. This is the midpoint slog, the sustained period of chaos where the rumor mill goes into overdrive and the machinery of the state begins to slowly, inexorably, crush its targets. The days following the first arrests are a blur of escalating paranoia. Hampton Court transforms from a palace into a prison. Guards are posted everywhere. No one is allowed to leave without permission. The very air thickens with dread. Every conversation is a whisper. Every glance is an analysis. Is he one of them? Did she know? Am I next? The plot which began in the singular mind of Cromwell now takes on a life of its own. A monstrous, self-perpetuating organism fed by fear. For the accused, this is a slow-motion nightmare. Take Sir Henry Norris, a close friend of the king, a man of status and honour. One moment he is joking with Henry, the next he is under house arrest in his own chambers. He has no information. He is just told to wait. The silence is a form of torture. He replays every conversation, every interaction with the Queen, searching for the moment, the word, the look that could have been misconstrued. He is being unmade, his identity as a loyal servant and friend being systematically dismantled in the minds of others, and he is powerless to stop it. The chaos is amplified by the interrogations which are now happening in earnest. Let's go back to Mark Smeaton. He's no longer in Cromwell's house. He's likely in the Tower of London. The Tower isn't just a prison. It's a symbol of ultimate state power. We need to get graphic here, anatomically precise. The rack was a common tool. Imagine Smeaton, stripped of his fine musician's clothes, laid out on a wooden frame. His wrists and ankles are tied to rollers. The interrogator asks a question. Who else was with the Queen? Smeaton, terrified, insists on her innocence. The torturer gives the lever a turn. The ropes bite into his flesh. His shoulders begin to dislocate, the sound a wet pop that echoes in the stone chamber. The pain is blinding, a white-hot supernova that obliterates thought. He screams. They ask again. Another turn. His ligaments tear. He can feel his own body being pulled apart. In this state, truth is meaningless. Survival is everything. He will say anything, confess to anything to make the pain stop. He names Norris. He names Brereton. He names Francis Weston. He might even name the man in the moon if they asked him to. His confession, broken and sobbing, is meticulously written down by a scribe. This document, oozing with the sweat and tears of agony, will be presented in court as evidence. This grinding process is repeated with others. Not everyone is tortured physically. For the noblemen like Norris and Weston, the torture is psychological. They are subjected to relentless questioning, sleep deprivation, the threat of the rack, and the news that others have already confessed and implicated them. They are told Smeaton has sung like a canary. They are told the king knows everything. They are trapped in a maze of lies, their own denials sounding increasingly hollow in the face of the confessions being stacked against them. The chaos infects the Queen herself. Anne is arrested and taken to the Tower, entering through the Traitor's Gate. The shock is profound. She reportedly falls to her knees, laughing and weeping hysterically, a mind breaking under the sheer absurdity of the situation. In her chambers, she is surrounded by ladies-in-waiting who are not her friends, but spies, instructed to record every word she says. Her babbling, her frantic denials, her confused reminiscences, it's all written down. "Oh, Norris, you are in the Tower for my sake," she might lament one moment, a statement of sympathy that is twisted into a confession of complicity. The midpoint is a slog of filth. The physical details are grotesque. The Tower would have been cold, damp, the stone walls weeping moisture. The food would be meagre. The constant clanging of keys, the distant sound of screams, the smell of fear and unwashed bodies. It's a sensory assault designed to break the human spirit. For the plotters, this is the most dangerous phase. The chaos they have unleashed could still spin out of control. They have to manage the narrative, carefully feeding selected leaks to the right ambassadors and courtiers to ensure the official story takes root. Cromwell is a master conductor of this orchestra of horror, ensuring each instrument of terror plays its part at the right time. This is not a single dramatic moment of confrontation. It is a slow, grinding, bureaucratic process of human destruction. It's the paperwork of damnation, the methodical collection of lies, the patient application of pain, all designed to turn a political problem into a closed case of treason. The sheer, sustained, intimate ugliness of it is the point. It's designed to wear down not just the victims, but anyone who might have considered defending them, until all that's left is a terrified silence and a universally accepted, monstrous lie. In any grand malevolent scheme, things are bound to go wrong, but in the Tudor court's version of political assassination, the going wrong part isn't a failure of the plan, it's a built-in feature. The downfall of the accused is designed to be as humiliating and anticlimactic as possible, a final, pathetic stripping away of dignity that serves as a warning to all who watch. The plan was never to have a fair fight. It was to orchestrate a collapse so total that heroism becomes impossible. The first thing to fall apart is any notion of a smoking gun. The plotters, for all their meticulous planning, have no actual evidence of adultery. They have a musician's confession extracted under torture, some hearsay from a terrified lady-in-waiting, and a collection of the Queen's own frantic, grief-stricken ramblings. In any real court of law, this would be laughed out of the room. But this isn't a real court. The downfall happens because the ultimate judge, King Henry, has already decided the verdict. The trial, when it finally comes, is the peak of this anticlimactic failure. It's pure political theatre. Imagine the scene at Westminster Hall, a huge, draughty medieval hall packed with the nobility of England. The Duke of Norfolk, Anne Boleyn's own uncle, is presiding as Lord High Steward. This is a deliberate, cruel touch, forcing a family member to oversee the destruction of his own kin. The accused are brought in, pale and gaunt from their time in the Tower. They are no longer the dashing, powerful figures of the court. They are broken men. The charges are read out, a ludicrous list of specific dates and places where the Queen, supposedly, committed adultery. The details are almost comical in their precision, claiming affairs happened at both Westminster and Hampton Court, with 5 different men, all within a few months. It's a logistical impossibility, a sexual marathon that would have been impossible to conceal in the crowded, gossipy confines of the court. The failure here is the failure of logic. The prosecution doesn't even try to make it believable. They don't have to. The purpose isn't to convince, but to overwhelm. The men all plead not guilty, except for the broken Smeaton, who sticks to his tortured confession, likely promised that this is his only path to a merciful, not disemboweled, death. The noblemen, particularly George Boleyn, the Queen's brother, try to defend themselves with dignity. George is known for his intelligence and wit. He refutes the charges point by point. The prosecution produces its bombshell against him, a piece of paper containing the details of the charge of incest. It's considered so obscene it's not even read aloud. The judges read it and pass it to George. He, in an act of defiant folly, reads the accusation out loud to the court, likely thinking its absurdity will prove his innocence. The charge is that he and Anne had joked that the king was a poor lover and impotent. It backfires spectacularly. Instead of shocking the court with the prosecution's absurdity, he has just announced to the world that he called the king a dud in the bedroom. He has committed political and social suicide. He has insulted the king's manhood, the ultimate sin. That is how it goes wrong. Not with a bang, but with a foolish, desperate miscalculation. The verdict is, of course, a foregone conclusion. Guilty on all charges. The downfall of the Queen herself is even more of a pathetic fizzle. Her trial is a separate affair, a smaller, more controlled event. She maintains her innocence with a composure that unnerves her accusers, but it's useless. The outcome was decided the moment Cromwell first whispered in the king's ear. The system is designed for failure. There is no appeal. There is no jury of her peers in any meaningful sense. Her judges are her political enemies. The ultimate anticlimax is the sentence itself. For the men, it is to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the standard brutal punishment for traitors. For the Queen, because of her rank, it is to be burning or beheading at the king's pleasure. Henry, in a final bizarre act of mercy, commutes the men's sentences to a simple beheading and famously grants Anne the privilege of being executed by a skilled swordsman from France rather than a clumsy English axeman. This isn't mercy. It's a final, perverse assertion of his control, a final twist of the knife. The downfall is not a dramatic tragedy. It is a bureaucratic, foregone conclusion. It's the undignified administrative end to a game that was rigged from the start. The victims are not martyrs in a grand struggle. They are simply erased, their desperate attempts to assert their innocence swallowed by a system that has no use for the truth. Even in a system designed for total subjugation, the human spirit has a nasty habit of resisting. But in the world of Tudor political purges, resistance is almost always futile, and escape is a fantasy. These small, flickering moments of defiance don't change the outcome. They just serve to highlight the crushing, monolithic power they are up against, making the final tragedy all the more bleak. The most visible form of resistance came from the accused themselves during their sham trials. We mentioned George Boleyn's disastrous attempt to expose the absurdity of the charges against him by reading them aloud. While it was a tactical failure, it was also an act of defiance. He refused to play the game by their rules, refused to be shamed into silence. He went down swinging, using the only weapon he had left, his voice, even if it only served to hasten his own end. It was a moment of personal integrity in a sea of choreographed lies. The other men, like Norris and Weston, resisted through stoic denial. They simply refused to confess despite immense pressure. Henry Norris was a particularly tough case for Cromwell. He was a close friend of the king, and Henry seems to have had a flicker of doubt about his guilt. He reportedly sent a messenger to Norris in the Tower, promising him his life if he would just confess and throw himself on the king's mercy. Norris refused. He chose to die with his honor intact rather than live with a lie. This was not a bid for escape. It was a choice about how he would be remembered. It was a small, personal victory of character over coercion, a final fuck you to the system that was about to kill him. Anne Boleyn's resistance was perhaps the most complex. In the Tower, she wrote her famous final letter to Henry. Whether the surviving copy is a later forgery or not, it perfectly captures the spirit of her defiance. The letter is a masterclass in controlled fury, a lawyerly defense of her innocence mixed with a wife's wounded appeal and a queen's righteous indignation. She reminds Henry of his duty to God, warns him of divine judgment, and pleads for the lives of the innocent men accused with her. "Try me, good king," she writes, "but let me have a lawful trial, and let not my sworn enemies sit as my accusers and judges." She is, in effect, holding up a mirror to the injustice of the proceedings. It achieved nothing, of course. The letter was likely never even shown to the king, but as an act of resistance, a final, eloquent testament recorded for posterity, it was powerful. Then there are the smaller, quieter acts of defiance. A servant who, under questioning, refuses to provide the damning testimony Cromwell wants. Their resistance is met not with a trial, but with the quiet horror of the torture chamber, their courage erased from the official record, their names forgotten by history. A friend at court who speaks up in defense of the accused, only to be immediately silenced with a threat. "Be careful, my lord. a rival might hiss. Such sympathy for traitors might be misunderstood. The risk of defending the condemned was so high that silence became the only survivable option. The most tragic narratives are the failed escapes. This wasn't a case of literally trying to tunnel out of the tower. The escape attempts were political. Perhaps a foreign ambassador, sympathetic to the Queen, tried to intervene, sending a dispatch back to his own king, urging him to pressure Henry. These attempts were easily swatted away. Henry's England was breaking from Europe. The opinions of foreign powers meant less than ever. The most poignant escape attempt was the failure of the system's own emotional safeguards. For a moment, it seems Henry himself might have cracked. The story of him offering Norris a pardon is a sign of a flicker of doubt, a moment where his personal affection for his friend almost broke through the wall of propaganda Cromwell had built. But the emotional crack sealed over. The political necessity of the purge and the deep wound to his own ego were too powerful. The system corrected itself. These moments of resistance are crucial because they prevent the story from being one of simple, passive victimhood. They show people fighting back with the limited tools they have: dignity, words, honor, and faith. But their failure is the core of the bleak lesson. In this world, your personal integrity is no match for the state's power to create its own reality. You can refuse to confess, but they will kill you anyway. You can write a beautiful defense, but no one will read it. Your resistance serves only to make your own death more certain, a final, ironic punishment for your refusal to play along. Just when you think the situation has reached its absolute nadir of horror and absurdity, the Tudor power game introduces a wildcard element. This is the point where the script gets thrown out and the plot escalates into something truly grotesque and surreal. The wildcard in the fall of Anne Boleyn wasn't an unexpected arrival or a reversal of fortune. It was the king's own galloping paranoia, latching on to the accusations and amplifying them into a dimension of pure, weaponized insanity. The initial plot, as conceived by Cromwell, was likely a relatively straightforward, if brutal, political maneuver: get rid of the Queen by proving adultery, thus allowing the king to remarry. The target was infidelity, but once the accusations reached Henry's ears, they began to fester in the petri dish of his ego and insecurity. The wild card was the moment Henry's personal neuroses fused with the state's legal machinery. This is when the charges escalated from simple adultery to high treason. Suddenly, this wasn't just about the Queen having affairs. According to the newly minted indictment, she and her lovers had actively conspired to kill the king. This was a quantum leap in severity. It transformed a sordid domestic drama into a plot against the crown itself. There was zero evidence for this. It was a pure invention, likely born from the interrogator's need to produce ever more dramatic confessions and the king's own self-aggrandizing fear that everyone must be plotting against someone as important as him. The logic was circular and insane. If the Queen was unfaithful, she must have wished the king dead so she could be with her lover. If she wished him dead, she must have been plotting his death. Therefore, adultery is proof of treason. It's a legal and logical monstrosity, but it served its purpose perfectly. It made the death penalty not just an option, but a patriotic necessity. The escalation didn't stop there. It spiraled into the truly bizarre. The prosecution needed to explain how so many men could have been a part of this. The answer? The Queen was a ravenous, insatiable seductress. They crafted a narrative of a woman so consumed by her frail and carnal appetites that she lured these men, one by one, into her web. This wasn't just a woman who made a mistake. This was a sexual predator, a monster of depravity. It was a character assassination so total that it bordered on the supernatural. And then came the most depraved escalation of all, the charge of incest with her brother, George Boleyn. This was Cromwell's masterstroke of filth. Adultery was shameful, treason was terrifying, but incest was unnatural. It was a sin against God and nature itself, an act so foul it placed the perpetrators outside the bounds of humanity. It was designed to provoke a visceral reaction of disgust in anyone who heard it, to strip the Boleyns of any shred of sympathy. The evidence for this was non-existent, likely based on the coerced and nonsensical testimony of George's own wife, Lady Rochford, who was politically estranged from him and had every reason to see him fall. The wild card element here is the way the accusation itself became the proof. The sheer horror of the charge of incest was so great that people reasoned no one would dare make it up. It had to be true because it was too awful to be a lie. This is the logic of the witch hunt, the mob mentality that feeds on its own escalating hysteria. The final surreal twist was the involvement of the church, now headed by the king himself. While the Queen was in the Tower awaiting execution for adultery, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was tasked with another job, finding a reason to annul her marriage to Henry. It was a legal paradox of staggering proportions. The state was preparing to execute her for being an adulterous wife, while the church was simultaneously preparing to declare that she had never been a legal wife in the first place. Cranmer, a man trapped between his reformist sympathies for Anne and his terror of the king, found a flimsy pretext: Henry's previous affair with Anne's sister, Mary. This, he argued, created a spiritual impediment to the marriage. Anne, likely seeing a sliver of hope that an annulment might save her life, or at least the life of her daughter Elizabeth, agreed to it. The result was the ultimate institutional insanity. On May 17th, Anne's marriage was declared null and void. She was now legally not the Queen and had never been. Yet 2 days later, on May 19th, she was publicly executed for committing adultery as the Queen. She was killed for betraying a husband she was legally declared to have never had. This is the wild card in its purest form. The moment the system becomes so consumed by its own perverse logic that it ceases to make any sense at all, yet continues to grind forward, a mindless, unstoppable machine of death. The main event is over. The axe, or in Anne's case, the fine French sword, has fallen. What's left is the quiet, grotesque landscape of the aftermath. The air, which moments before was thick with the collective gasp of the crowd, is now hollow and still. This is the fallout, the immediate, grim business of tying up loose ends and cleaning up the mess, both literal and political. The scene on Tower Green, immediately following Anne Boleyn's execution, would have been one of surreal and chilling efficiency. Her body, still warm, would have been bundled unceremoniously into a cheap elm chest, an old arrow chest according to some accounts, as no one had bothered to arrange for a proper coffin. There was no dignity here. Her ladies-in-waiting, weeping, would have covered her head and torso with a simple cloth. The executioner, the expert from Calais, would be wiping his blade, his job done. He had performed his task with clinical precision, a quick, clean strike. He would collect his handsome fee and disappear back across the channel, a foreign specialist hired for a uniquely English problem. The blood on the scaffold would be soaking into the straw laid down to absorb it. The smell, that coppery, metallic tang, would hang in the air. The crowd, which had stood in silent awe, would now begin to disperse, their faces a mixture of shock, pity, and a kind of grim satisfaction. They had witnessed history, a spectacle of state power that was both terrifying and thrilling. They would carry the memory of the Queen's final, dignified speech and the shocking speed of her death back to their homes and taverns, where the story would be told and retold, mutating with each telling. The clean-up is a blunt, physical process. Servants would come to dismantle the scaffold. The blood-soaked straw would be gathered and burned. The arrow chest containing the remains of the Queen of England would be carried a few short steps to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the Tower's parish church. She would be buried in an unmarked grave in the chancel, laid to rest beside the headless body of her own brother George, who had been executed 2 days earlier. The space was already crowded with the bodies of other notable traitors. It was the Tower's boneyard, a final, anonymous resting place for the state's most famous failures. The looting begins almost immediately, though it's not a frenzied mob grabbing at jewels. It's a quiet, bureaucratic looting. Cromwell's agents would already be taking inventory of the executed men's properties. Their lands, their homes, their titles, all are now forfeit to the crown. Messengers would be riding out across the country to seize these assets. The fall of one great family is the opportunity for another. Courtiers who had played their cards right, who had sided with the winners, would soon be petitioning the king for a grant of land, a piece of the Boleyn inheritance. The king's coffers swell, and the loyalty of his supporters is rewarded with the spoils of the dead. For the victors, the immediate aftermath is a moment of quiet, tense triumph. Cromwell has succeeded. His gamble has paid off spectacularly. He is now, without question, the most powerful man in England besides the king. But it's a victory without joy. He knows better than anyone how precarious this position is. He has just written the playbook on how to dispose of a political rival. He knows that one day it could be used against him. The atmosphere at court is one of exhausted relief and profound unease. The immediate crisis is over, but a terrifying precedent has been set. The king has learned just how easy it is to remove a wife who displeases him. Within 24 hours of Anne's execution, Archbishop Cranmer issued a special dispensation allowing Henry to marry Jane Seymour. 11 days after his previous wife's head was severed from her body, King Henry VIII was married for the 3rd time. The transition is seamless, shockingly swift. It's a brutal statement of intent. The past is erased. The Queen is dead. Long live the Queen. The immediate fallout is a hollowed-out world. The witty, vibrant, reformist court of the Boleyns is gone, replaced by the more conservative, somber mood of the Seymours. The halls that once echoed with music and laughter are now quiet, the courtiers treading carefully, their faces scrubbed of any emotion that could be misinterpreted. It's the silence of a battlefield after the fighting has stopped, a landscape littered with political corpses and haunted by the ghosts of the recently brutally dispatched. The physical horror of the execution is swift, but the psychological trauma lingers, seeping into the foundations of the court and poisoning the minds of those who survived. This isn't about grief or remorse. Those are dangerous luxuries. It's about the deep, permanent scars left by witnessing and participating in such a brutal and calculated purge. The coping mechanisms are as dark and twisted as the events that caused them. For the winners, like Thomas Cromwell, the primary psychological scar is a heightened state of paranoia. He has seen firsthand that power is not a fortress, it's a tightrope. He has just demonstrated that no one, not even the Queen, is safe. This knowledge is not empowering, it's terrifying. He must now live in constant fear of a rival using his own methods against him. Every new face at court is a potential threat, every whispered conversation a possible plot. His coping mechanism is to double down on what he does best: control. He expands his network of spies, monitors correspondence more closely, and ruthlessly eliminates any nascent threat. His life becomes a joyless, sleepless exercise in risk management, the constant grinding work of staying one step ahead of the executioner's axe he so expertly wields for others. For the king, the trauma is of a different, more narcissistic kind. Henry has to live with the reality of what he has done. He has executed the woman he once moved heaven and earth to marry, the mother of his child. To cope, he engages in a profound act of psychological revisionism. He must believe, absolutely and without a shred of doubt, that Anne was guilty of everything she was accused of. He surrounds himself with people who reinforce this narrative. He obsesses over her supposed crimes, turning her into a monstrous figure in his own mind. This isn't just political spin, it's a psychological necessity. To admit even the possibility of her innocence would be to admit that he was either a fool who was duped or a tyrant who murdered an innocent woman. Both conclusions are unbearable to his ego, so he buries the trauma under layers of self-righteous fury. His coping mechanism is rage, a rage that will only deepen and become more unpredictable as he ages. For the vast majority of the court, the survivors, the primary coping mechanism is emotional numbness and a cynical, dark humor. They have learned the ultimate lesson: loyalty is temporary, alliances are fatal, and enthusiasm is a form of suicide. They develop a kind of political shell shock. They learn to say nothing of substance, to wear a mask of pleasant neutrality at all times. The humor, when it surfaces, is bleak. A joke about the French swordsman's availability, a quip about being careful not to catch the king's eye. It's the gallows humor of people living in a dangerous, unpredictable environment. It's a way of acknowledging the horror without succumbing to the terror of it. Then there's the trauma of the children. Princess Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, is now a living symbol of the whole sordid affair. Overnight, she goes from being the heir to the throne to a bastard, her title stripped, her mother executed for treason and incest. She is removed from the line of succession and largely ignored. We can only speculate on the psychological impact of growing up as the daughter of a woman officially branded a monster. Her entire life would be a process of coping with this foundational trauma, learning to navigate a world that saw her as the tainted fruit of a poisonous tree. Her reserved, cautious, and intensely private nature as Queen Elizabeth II was forged in these early years of disgrace and fear. Finally, there is the lingering trauma for the institution of the monarchy itself. The purge has revealed the terrible fragility behind the opulent facade. It has shown that the sacred bonds of marriage and kinship mean nothing in the face of political expediency. The court becomes a place of profound emotional dishonesty. No one can trust anyone. Love, friendship, and family are now just variables in a cold political equation. The psychological scar is a deep, abiding cynicism that infects every relationship, every alliance, every whispered promise. The whole episode leaves behind a collective post-traumatic stress, a shared memory of a time when the world went mad, and the only way to survive was to forget you ever had a soul. The execution of a queen and a handful of courtiers isn't just a personal tragedy or a palace drama. It's a seismic event that sends shockwaves rippling out through the entire society. The purge of the Boleyn faction had profound and lasting consequences for England's law, its economy, and its very soul. The most immediate and terrifying ripple effect was on the law itself. The trials were a legal farce, but they set a terrifying precedent. They established that the king's will was, in effect, the law. The concept of treason was radically expanded. Before, treason was generally understood as taking up arms against the king. Now, it could mean simply imagining his death or even just saying something that wounded his ego. The Treason Act was later refined to make it a crime to even predict the king's death. This created a climate of fear where any stray word, any drunken complaint could be twisted into a capital offense. The law was no longer a shield for the innocent. It had been weaponized, turned into an instrument of terror and social control. Cromwell had shown how the legal system could be expertly manipulated to provide a veneer of legitimacy for what was essentially a political murder. This debasement of the law would have long-lasting effects, creating a deep-seated distrust of royal justice that would fester for generations. The economic impact was also significant. The Boleyns and their allies, men like Norris, Weston, and Brereton, were not just courtiers, they were wealthy landowners. Their execution meant the forfeiture of vast estates to the crown. This was a massive transfer of wealth and property. Henry used these confiscated lands to enrich the royal treasury and, more importantly, to reward his supporters. The Seymour family and their allies were suddenly showered with new titles and estates. This created a new class of loyalists whose wealth and status were directly tied to the king and the new regime. It was a brutal but effective way of cementing the power of the new order. The purge served as a stark economic warning. Your property and your lineage are only as secure as your loyalty to the king. On a larger scale, the fall of Anne Boleyn had a huge impact on the English Reformation. Anne had been a passionate advocate for religious reform, a patron of Protestant scholars and translators. Her removal was a major victory for the conservative, Catholic-leaning faction at court, led by men like the Duke of Norfolk and Bishop Stephen Gardiner. With Anne gone, the pace of reform slowed. While Henry never returned England to the authority of the Pope, the religious direction of the country became more conservative for a time. The public health of the nation was, ironically, also affected, though in a more metaphorical sense. The disease that spread was not syphilis, but fear. The public spectacle of the executions was a form of mass communication. The message sent from the scaffold on Tower Hill was unambiguous. This is what happens to those who displease the king. This fear trickled down through all levels of society. It silenced dissent, discouraged political debate, and fostered an atmosphere of paranoid conformity. The nation was being taught to speak in whispers. And what of the next generation? The fate of Anne's daughter, Elizabeth, is the most famous example. Declared a bastard, she was cast into the political wilderness for years. Her very existence was a political problem, a living reminder of a past the king wanted to erase. The children of the other executed men faced similar ruin. Their family names were disgraced, their inheritances gone. They were the orphans of a political storm, forced to navigate a world that saw them as the offspring of traitors. The entire episode perpetuated a cycle of instability. By demonstrating such a brutal method of resolving political and marital disputes, Henry set a pattern. His later execution of his fifth wife, Catherine Howard, for similar charges of adultery, followed the same grim playbook. The ripple effect was the creation of a new normal at the heart of English power, a system where sexual politics, judicial murder, and naked ambition were the accepted tools of governance. The splash from Anne's severed head falling on the scaffold rippled outwards, disturbing the waters of English society for decades to come. History is not what happened. History is the story that the winners write after they've cleaned up the bodies. The final, most cynical act in the drama of Anne Boleyn's fall was the systematic rewriting of her legacy. The brutal, grubby reality of a political assassination was immediately spun, sanitized, and mythologized, twisted into a narrative that served the agendas of those left standing. It's a bitter lesson in how a person can be murdered twice, first with a sword and then with a quill. In the immediate aftermath, the official, state-sanctioned story was one of monstrous depravity justly punished. Cromwell and the government propaganda machine went into overdrive. Pamphlets and official chronicles painted Anne as the great whore, a Jezebel who had bewitched the good king with sorcery and then cuckolded him with half the court, including her own brother. She was a stain on the nation's honor, a source of spiritual corruption whose removal was an act of national cleansing. This was the narrative fed to the public and to foreign courts. It was simple, lurid, and effective. It justified the king's actions and solidified the legitimacy of his new marriage to Jane Seymour, who was presented as Anne's exact opposite, meek, gentle, and pure. The story was a simple morality play of the whore versus the virgin, and it was crucial for calming a nervous and confused nation. But as the political and religious winds shifted, so did the story. When Anne's own daughter, Elizabeth I, ascended to the throne, the official narrative had to be radically rewritten. You can't have the founder of a new Protestant dynasty be the daughter of a condemned incestuous traitor. So the historians and polemicists of the Elizabethan era performed a complete reversal. Anne was resurrected and recast as a Protestant martyr. She was no longer a whore but a virtuous queen and a champion of the true faith, brought down by the wicked plots of her Catholic enemies. In this version, Cromwell, once the loyal servant of the state, became a shadowy villain, a Machiavellian schemer who framed the innocent queen. The men executed with her were transformed from treasonous lovers into noble victims who died for their Protestant convictions. This new myth was just as much a political construction as the old one. It served to legitimize Elizabeth's reign and to cement England's identity as a Protestant nation, standing against the Catholic powers of Europe. Her mother's sordid end was transformed into a heroic founding myth. And what about the romance? That came later. The Victorians, with their insatiable appetite for tragic, historical love stories, latched on to the drama of Henry and Anne. They stripped away the brutal politics and the religious conflict and reframed it as a passionate, doomed love affair. Henry became the tempestuous, romantic hero, and Anne the tragic, beautiful victim of his tyrannical love. The story of her downfall became a Gothic romance, full of secret letters, tearful farewells, and noble suffering. The real Anne, the sharp, ambitious, intelligent, and often ruthless political player, was erased, replaced by a wilting, tragic heroine. The bitter legacy is this triple distortion. The complex, messy reality of a political power struggle fueled by religious anxiety and personal ambition was flattened into one of three simple, digestible stories: the story of the monster, the story of the martyr, or the story of the tragic lover. Each version tells you more about the people who wrote it than it does about the actual events. The truth, the stinking, terrifying, and deeply cynical truth about how power really works, was buried deeper than Anne's body in its unmarked grave. We tell ourselves these stories because the reality is too uncomfortable. The reality is that people are not heroes or villains. They are just desperate, ambitious, and fearful. The reality is that justice is often just a pretty word for the will of the powerful. The reality is that history is not a grand, noble procession. It's a chaotic, bloody scramble for survival. But we prefer the myth. We want the romance, the martyrdom, the clear-cut morality. We scrub the filth away, polish the bones, and put them on display, telling ourselves a comforting lie about the past to make ourselves feel better about the present. So, we've scrubbed the story clean, haven't we? We've taken a brutal political hit job, a masterclass in reputation destruction fueled by sexual panic and state-sponsored terror, and turned it into a tragic romance or a tale of religious martyrdom. We've made Anne Boleyn a character in a costume drama, her horrifying, calculated end reduced to a sad song or a dramatic scene. We prefer the myth of the great love or the great injustice because the alternative is to look at the machinery of it all. To see how a whisper can become a rumor can become a fact, and a fact can become a death sentence. To see how a person's private life, their texts, their photos, their associations, can be systematically weaponized to destroy their public one. Does any of this sound familiar? Forget the velvet and the swords for a moment. Think about the mechanics. A powerful figure is deemed inconvenient. A campaign begins, not with an army, but with whispers online. A faction of enemies, united by ambition or ideology, starts to dig. An old, out-of-context tweet is unearthed. A private message is leaked. A problematic friendship is highlighted. Anonymous accounts, the modern equivalent of Cromwell's spies, amplify the narrative. They create a fog of accusation, a storm of outrage. It doesn't have to be true, it just has to be plausible enough to go viral. The target's character is assassinated in public. They are declared toxic, a monster, a source of pollution in the body politic of the internet. Their allies fall silent, terrified of being caught in the blast radius. Their employer, the modern-day king, feels the pressure. They issue a statement full of solemn, hypocritical gravity about our values and cut the target loose. The mob, having tasted blood, moves on to the next target. The process is faster now, the axe replaced by the block button, but the fundamental architecture of the purge is identical. It's the same use of shame as a weapon, the same public trial without due process, the same reliance on the idea that an accusation, if repeated loudly enough, becomes its own proof. We look back at the Tudor court and call it barbaric, a relic of a savage, unenlightened age. We congratulate ourselves on our progress, our enlightened systems of justice, and our sophisticated understanding of human rights. But have we really changed the game, or have we just updated the technology? We traded the tower for Twitter, the executioner's sword for the algorithm. The human impulse to destroy our rivals by attacking their reputation, by weaponizing their sex lives, by turning them into monsters in the court of public opinion, that hasn't gone anywhere. It's crawling all over the device in your hand right now. So, as you sit there in your clean, modern world, so far removed from the stench and terror of Hampton Court, ask yourself this. When you watch someone get torn apart online, when you scroll past the latest cancellation, are you a horrified spectator? Or are you just part of the crowd watching the blade fall and feeling that same timeless, terrible little thrill